Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the BioHackers podcast. I'm your co-host, David James Clark IV, here with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Alex Feltus. How you doing today, Alex?
Pretty good, David. How you doing?
Awesome, awesome. Are you excited? This is podcast number 2.
I'm very excited about our guest.
Yes, this is going to be a good one. So cue the opening theme. Hey, all right. Welcome back. So before we bring on Reed Bender, I want to talk a little bit about today's topic, chaos theory. And one thing I've noticed is the 80s and 90s are having a moment. You know, it's pretty crazy with all of the nostalgia flying around. We just had a second Top Gun movie. We've got a fourth Jurassic Park movie. Bell bottoms are back in. But I think the key element, the key connection to today's topic is Jurassic Park and that great character, the Jeff Goldblum character, Ian Malcolm, who is the chaotician, the chaos theory mathematician, kind of made chaos theory popular in the 90s, you know, as a pop culture reference. And he had a great line in that movie that I wanted to get your take on. When he was trying to describe, you know, the dinosaurs were, no matter how much we tried to control them, they were going to break out of their confines. They were going to break through, you know, the controls, the biological controls that were put in place. And he said, life will find a way. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what that means to you, because that's a really cool line that stuck with me.
Yeah, this is like philosophical / like genetics, evolutionary science kind of blend for me, but like everything that comes out of nature, like from an original gene set, however it got here on Earth, is just being drawn forward in time through randomness and selection. Like evolution is really simple. You just, you know, have changes in your genes or recombinations of your genes and pass it on to your kids, right? Your offspring, and that passes forward these traits. And the ones that are better adaptive, more fit, can go forward. So everything in life is built around randomness. But what's cool is there's some sort of organizing principles in the randomness that is in our universe that drives it forward, this process. So it's not like completely crazy. And that's what chaos theory really captures, is that taking what appears to be random and seeing repeating patterns in it at different scales. And you can see it at, you know, looking at the tree branches, right? You can go and look at how the bifurcating structure of trees and picture it, like, you know, with no leaves on it on a winter day, and see these patterns. And you can see the same thing in your capillary beds inside you. You can even like go way out into the cosmos and see dark matter have like the same kind of structure. So there's something about the universe, some organizing principles that this randomness kind of rides on top of. And I don't think anybody really knows what that is, right? I think we're in our infancy in trying to understand this kind of stuff. But to me, that's what it's about. And I like to look at biological systems from a systems perspective and not like breaking it into little pieces. And this kind of chaos theory and other type of modeling techniques are really, I think, the future of science.
And it will be interesting to get Reed's take on that, because I know, you know, he's one of your ex-students, former students, and a colleague who's participated in some of our biohackathons, and someone who's taking a very unique approach to the study of genomics and computational biology, to cancer and other things, more at a systems level. And in our first podcast, you know, we did talk about reductionist versus systems, you know, approaches to science. And chaos theory is that really interesting kind of mathematical computational model for helping try and find order in nonlinear systems.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see his take. I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but he has a very unique, you know, perspective on it. So as you've been approaching your science and thinking about, you know, the new age of computational science, do you feel like just having this ability to compute gigaflops and exascale data and the technology that exists today is giving us a more power to embrace chaos theory in systems biology, where maybe in 20 years ago that wasn't the case?
Oh yeah, the amount of data we're accumulating, especially like at the molecular level in biology, is just amazing and rich and very big. It's very difficult to process it. And so I think that we have the ability to see the natural world and be in a way that is such high resolution that you have to have computers to be able to see the picture with that. But I think we're on the verge of like maybe it's not this bad, but going from alchemy to chemistry, I
Mm.
think we're in that kind of a phase transition. No pun intended.
I
I don't know if
love
the
that.
alchemist would agree with me on that though.
Yeah. Hey, well, that's a great segue. Let's phase transition into the guest portion of the show. Thank you, and welcome our friend Reed Bender.
Yes.
Welcome back, biohackers. We're very lucky to have our good friend Reed Bender with us today. How you doing today, Reed?
Doing great. Thank you guys so much for having me. This is really cool.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't think of a better podcast number 2 topic than chaos theory. But you've got a really interesting angle on chaos theory. Before we get there, Alex, why don't you tell us how you know Reed and give us a little bit of his background?
Yeah, Reed worked in my lab at Clemson University. We met years ago. I think it was like 2016, 2017 in there. And we've been collaborating ever since.
Yeah.
Sometimes every day, and now a little less frequently.
But
Yeah,
through the
for about 5 years
biohackathon,
now.
through the Praxis Biohackathon, you guys have kind of reunited, and now you're attending office hours. I think you were just talking about chaos theory yesterday. So
Yeah.
here we are on the podcast. So Reed, tell us a little bit about what it was like being in Alex's lab.
Yeah. So I joined it kind of towards the end of my sophomore year, beginning of my junior year, while I was working at Clemson. And I joined it basically by reaching out to a variety of genetics professors, knowing I wanted to do research in the field, but having very little introductions to the field. And so I sent cold call emails to a bunch of professors and pretty much got one response, which was from Alex, which was really cool. And so he offered me a spot in his lab beginning with my junior year, which would have been 2017. And it was funny because at that point I had no computational experience. I didn't know anything about systems genetics, chaos theory, coding in general. And it was very much of an open invitation of if you're willing to learn and want to use these tools, like, come on in. And so that's kind of where I got started with all of this stuff.
Wow, that's a great story, Reed. You just basically laid out the whole vision plan for the biohacker community. Is people from interdisciplinary backgrounds. So you were a biologist then?
Yeah. I was a bioengineer was my background.
Bioengineer.
It was more engineering on the biology side before this.
But
that kind of does give some context for why I'm so gung-ho about this mission, because it's quite literally how I got involved in it. So I'm very much a fan of what you guys are doing here with Praxis AI and happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. And Alex, your mantra is always, hey, if you're willing to put in the work and learn how to learn how to use the command line, learn true computational power, then the sky's the limit.
Yeah, and also the Reed's distinction of like I do genetics and basic science is the department I'm in, but whenever an engineer is interested, I'm extremely interested because they think about problems in a much more holistic way, much more practical. Let's actually make it work way. It's fantastic to have them in the lab with basic scientists. It's a great interdisciplinary mix. Love it.
Yeah, I learned a ton. So, and here I am because of it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and the biohackers the same. And I know going through some of your journeys, Alex, I attended some of those bioinformatics classes. I think Reed, you might have been gone by then, but the cross-platform, computer science meets wet science meets life science meets bioscience is a really interesting mix. And you kind of see the power of integrating synergy between, seemingly disseparate systems. I know that you've got another integration you're working on, Reed. So why don't you tell us a little bit, something surprising and interesting about yourself, because I think the audience is going to love to hear about this yoga.
Yeah, that's a cool way to tee it up. So one thing, a lot of people are actually surprised because my engineering background, I've always been very much of a rationalist, very much of an following the scientific method, and very interested in much more rational discussion around science. But kind of to balance that out, one thing that surprises a lot of people is that I'm actually a certified yoga instructor, and I've been studying that for about 3 or 4 years now. And so that is really cool because one thing I love about yoga is the emphasis it places more on kind of, as we were saying before, the holistic aspect of it. And it's more about incorporating a larger array of your anatomy, your mental states, consciously breathing. So there's a lot of stuff about yoga that I think complements the scientific method very well. But what's cool about yoga for me is that it really is, if you look back at the text from India, and if you look back at the way it was depicted long ago, you can really begin to pull it away from the religion of Hinduism of India, and yoga really does become a science in and of its own right. It's a science of the body. It's a science of how the breath works, and it's a science of how energy moves around the body, and how harmony and balance is maintained. And so I think studying that and learning that kind of on my own in conjunction with more of the systems biology and base science and engineering curriculum, I think have given, I've learned to see the world and see a lot of these more complicated, complex system problems in a much more different light. And so it's kind of cool to be able to come into a conversation like this with a bit of a different background to see these kind of problems with.
Maybe Reed, could you give your view on what systems biology is? Because I think I'm a systems biologist. I'm still not exactly sure what it is.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure we'll get into this more as we begin to talk about chaos theory. I think this is a great segue into that, because when I think about systems genetics, I really begin to think about kind of, again, we're going to overuse this word, I'm sure, but more of a holistic approach to the basic science of genetics. Most of science, ever since, the sequencing of the human genome, and even before that, when you were doing simple knockout studies, trying to identify, the needle in the haystack for various diseases, various inheritable traits, the central dogma has really been for a long time now, let's find the key gene, let's find a biomarker, or let's find a gene that we know can correlate with a particular phenotype, and then see maybe if we can find drugs that can perturb that or act on that. Or maybe we can look at inheritability studies and see how genes pass down through populations. And all of that is very reductionistic. It looks for a particular gene. It's more looking for a needle in a haystack. When in reality, what we have with our DNA is really about 23,000 protein coding genes, and that's 23,000 different variables, different knobs on the dial that are your body that you can tune. And so genetics as a general field is having a really hard time right now understanding complex systems like we are by looking at single genes in isolation. And so systems genetics really, I think the purpose of it is to study the genes and study the transcriptome and study how your body is working without removing anything from the system. It's looking at all of the pieces in conjunction with the part they play within the whole. And so it's looking at the system as it actually operates. It's like trying to study a car while the car is moving, as opposed to stopping it and taking out the transmission.
It's like doing yoga just with your one finger.
Yeah, exactly. You need to. There's a sense where you need to understand how it all works as a comprehensive system, and that's really where the gold is going to be gleaned.
Yeah, I really like the way you're thinking about it that way, and that allows you to bring a new perspective to a lot of your science and the bioscience genetic work you're doing. I know that we've interacted a little bit on this BioHackathon with Bill Passman, the Passman hackathon, and you came at it kind of looking at a holistic. It was interesting, the different camps that came up. The long non-coding RNA group. You had the chaos theory group. You had But looking at it more from a systems perspective gave you a whole new, insight into what might be going on with Bill, who has this rare kidney cancer, but also now a brain tumor. And, are those things related? Well, they're in the same body. And Bill got super excited as the patient about, this new way of thinking about medicine. And in his particular case, precision medicine, one person. Yeah. So we were talking earlier about Jurassic Park, which is making a big comeback, and I talked about chaos theory and that the Jeff Goldblum character, and he had this great line, "Life will find a way," and and I asked Alex, what does that mean to him? What does that mean to you when you think about chaos theory in biosciences?
So I love that quote, and I love the idea that life will find a way, because I think at the root of that. this, we can go as deep as we want into this, because I think that really does open up into, you can turn that into even a theological discussion of, is there some greater ordering principle that is giving rise to the complexity we see in living systems? And I think that quote of life will find a way is somehow trying to address this problem of how do complex, ordered, coherent systems arise out of a chaotic, unpredictable, entropy-driven world. In a world that is trending towards randomness and increasing disorder, how do we get human bodies that are so coherent and so ordered? And so I think that quote is a really just beautiful way of depicting that idea of somehow this ordering principle will always find a way to bring order out of that underlying chaos. And I think that's the foundation. That's really what chaos theory is getting at.
Are you looking for that ordering principle?
So I think that's partly what has led me down this road and down this whole beginning with systems genetics. It's one of those things I believe that my, emailing you and your response to me and getting involved in the lab and pursuing a career in systems genetics and more of this holistic biology approach, I think has been extremely synchronistic for that reason, because it's largely been something that I've been searching for of, just asking the question of how do complex systems arise out of something that should be random? The universe is inherently chaotic. We don't know what's happening. We have zero idea how to make a seed sprout in the ground. You plant a seed and you can predict that a flower will grow out of it. But in reality, throughout 2 decades of, rigorous searching and however long the scientific method, whatever benchmark you want to place on it for where the really rigorous scientific method began, we still don't know how a flower blooms. We don't know what that ordering principle is that, makes complexity and makes living systems arise out of dirt otherwise. And so I think that that's largely what's gotten me interested in this, is really just trying to understand that. And it's a pipe dream, because it's, one thing that I think if we have a little bit of humility, we can accept we probably never will understand in its entirety. But that doesn't mean it's not something to strive for.
Flying was a pipe dream not too long ago, right? And
yeah, I love that analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm excited what's going to happen.
And living on Mars is Elon Musk's pipe dream for right now. So we'll see how long it takes us to do that. But so you bring up a very interesting point about the way that, the scientific method, the reductionist kind of process, works, and the power of crowdsourcing. You think about the world is flat and, crowdsourcing, and, some of what we're doing right now with the podcast is our ability, we're disintermediating the publishing industry by, just posting our podcast and getting the word out there. So, is it possible for a crowdsourced community like the Biohackers, using some of these computational tools and these theories, chaos theory, systems genetics, like you're talking about, to disintermediate maybe some of what's happening in the scientific and medical fields? And, in coordination, right, with them, we don't want to blow up the world, but the idea that I think we can maybe make some quantum leaps in discovery by doing that. Is that an interesting path for you?
I definitely hope so. I'm encouraged when I look at the scientific field right now. I think on one hand, there's a lot of reason to be discouraged. I think that it's becoming increasingly niche. I think more and more people are studying more and more
specialized,
nuanced.
Yeah,
exactly. You're looking at a tighter and tighter sliver of the world. And so I think that as, that's just, the medical field is moving in that direction. The university system is moving in that direction. And I think there's this push for postdocs and PhDs. And, this is something that I was really wrestling with when I was trying to decide, do I want to go and pursue a PhD, or do I want to go and work in industry, or do I want to pursue something else? And one of the things that initially discouraged me about the prospect of pursuing a PhD and getting really involved in that academia center of research, the way that's working currently, is that exactly that point of everybody is looking at increasingly complicated systems with blinders on to the other complex systems that fill the world around us. And so I think that has led to a lot of issues where people are not seeing the whole picture. And people are very narrowed into a particular way of seeing the world. And it's kind of leaving us in a position where a lot of people know a lot of things about fewer and fewer pieces of our world.
Yeah,
and so I think that part of what the Biohacker, this whole idea promises is a way to decentralize that and pull it out of these increasingly siloed institutions where individuals who just have passion and have interests have the tools at their own disposal to go and learn whatever they need. And I think that, you know, even Praxis AI and biohackers aside, I think that this is just a trend in the world in a more general sense right now. You know, you can look at the publication industries and scientific publications and how those have been blocked behind a paywall for a very, very long time now. And the paywall is becoming increasingly expensive. But then you have things like Sci-Hub, which are, you know, democratizing that and taking scientific publications and open sourcing them to the world, where the high school student in rural America can access the most cutting edge of scientific research and computational tools. And that same student, if they were very curious, could go onto AWS and get a free trial membership and start using computational tools because the tutorials are available. And I think that that's one thing that Praxis AI is doing a really cool job of, is removing one of those barriers of friction, where instead of having to go to AWS, they have the compute at their fingertips already with tutorials to tell them how to get started. And so I'm really encouraged when I look at Praxis AI and I just look at the direction that the scientific field is moving in general, because I do think it's moving more in that democratized, decentralized, open source framework. And I think that once we get to that point and continue to move in that direction, we'll see much less of this siloing off into niche subjects and much more people who are approaching problems with a much more holistic mindset. That's my hope, at least.
Do you think that we need compute to do this? Because I mean, like you mentioned that, and like, is it because when we measure things, like, are we just going to have to measure so many things that we need fast computers to analyze it? I mean, can you do it on a piece of paper? To date myself.
Yeah. So I think it's to that point exactly. I think that you used to be able to do physics with a piece of paper, and you can still do theoretical physics. You know, there's armchair physicists for sure. I think it's very difficult to conceptualize an armchair biologist. Just because of how complex the system is. Not to say that the universe and physical laws of nature are not complex, but it's much more tangible. We can see the world around us. It's much more difficult to see the way a cell is working. It's very hard to generate an intuition about the way that genes are being expressed in your cells, because it's something that is so foreign if you haven't actually seen it in a computer or plotted on a like a UMAP plot or a t-SNE plot, or various ways of displaying this complex genomic or biological data. And so I think that while I do hope that there's much more theoretical work that goes into of people who just have wild ideas of maybe this is how the body works, and then float those out there in an open source way of just, you know, putting their ideas out there with zero compute necessary and let other people run with it. But I do think for some of the more complex questions of actually understanding how the body is working at a cellular level, you know, breaking it down to the resolution of looking at cells, I think we have the technology now with all of this high throughput, all these new high throughput technologies like single cell RNA sequencing to actually answer those questions for the first time. So I think to answer your question more pointedly, that will require a lot of compute. And I think that's why it's really neat that y'all are making those tools available. But I'm also encouraged by the idea of potential armchair biologists who could just have wild intuitions that prove to be really leaps and bounds forward in the field.
But I guess so if you have the idea, I mean, if you're doing science, you're going to have to test it, right? If you have a hypothesis. Exactly. I wonder if you can even test it. Because it used to be you could go and just capture a few things, capture a few dragonflies, and, you know, see if they're different than the other dragonflies. And that's great on a macro scale, but is that molecular scale? It just seems like the resolution is getting higher and higher. Like the single cell, this is a complicated thing for me. I've been doing this for over, 25 years.
Yeah.
Like single cell RNA sequencing. Can you kind of explain what that is in layman's terms?
Yeah, sure. So single cell RNA sequencing, what the way the technology works, and why it is such a revolution is because in the past, kind of giving the backstory of what led up to single cell RNA sequencing, was primarily all of the work was being done with bulk RNA sequencing, where you can take a tissue, let's say you have a kidney, because that's what you're working with in the context of Bill Passman, and you can essentially remove the kidney, or you can look at cell lines, you can look at really any cellular or tissue system you have, and if you have the tissue in hand, what you would do is essentially, in a more complex manner, you take the tissue, you put it in a blender, you extract the RNA, and then you look at the quantities of different genes that are transcribed. And if you can say that one gene is transcribed at a significantly higher level than another, based purely on the number of these transcripts you count inside of the hodgepodge of cells you've blended up, you can get a general sense for how the tissue as a whole is expressing these genes. And so you can say maybe there's a particular protein that we know to be an oncogene, a cancer driver. And if you lyse a cancerous kidney and you do bulk RNA sequencing, sure enough, what you'll find is upregulation of those oncogenes, if you know the right one to look for, and that's happened to see what is happening in the system. So that's the way it's been working in the past, but the resolution you're looking at is very coarse because all you can really see is at the general tissue level. One thing that we know, though, about cancer in general and a lot of these various diseases is that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the cancers. And so the cells on one end of the tissue might look completely different from another end of the tissue. And this is particularly extreme in cases like cancer, but even in a totally healthy tissue, this is going to be the case. You know, in the liver, you have the portal vein and the central vein, and you have this localization of the various cells on the liver. And the cells on one end are going to express totally different patterns of genes than on the other. And so this idea of blending up the entire tissue, sequencing the genes, and then trying to get some high-level picture of what the tissue is doing is not really that realistic. It can give you a very high-level view of what's happening in a system, but you don't have the resolution to look at what's happening across a time series or at particular cell types within the tissue. So like you can't differentiate the hepatocytes from the stellate cells, for example, you know, in the liver. Like there's different cell types in each tissue, and you need to be able to differentiate those. And so single cell RNA sequencing, what it does is it basically does this process of cutting up the tissue, but then it encapsulates every single cell as its own measurement, essentially. And so what you're doing is you are getting that same kind of gene expression measurements, but you're getting it at the resolution of each individual cell. And so all of a sudden with this new technology, what we can do is we can put an entire tissue into the sequencer, and throughout these various methods, you know, it takes a molecular biologist who knows the science of actually how to do the sequencing. But what you get is this resolution where you are now looking at the gene expression values of individual cells across a tissue. And so what that does is it basically allows you to zoom in. It's the genetics equivalent of looking with your eye versus looking with an electron scanning microscope. That's really what single cell sequencing has offered.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of, I mean, I've thought about this. It's almost like the ultimate resolution, right? Like, because now we can take a bunch of people and we can go and sequence their DNA from their blood, right? And we can go and see what their DNA sequences is down to the exact nucleotide differences, or the ATGCs, the alphabet of DNA between everybody. And we could look at the gene expression levels, the output of that DNA on a bulk tissue perspective, right? To sequence the whole oasis.
Yeah.
Instead of going into looking at crocodiles and trying to understand crocodiles. But then we could go that resolution. I know the tech is still not quite there to be able to see like every gene expressed. And as we go deeper and look even further, that's just a technology issue in my mind.
Yeah, it's largely... And that plus cost. And so I think this gets to your point you had made before about, you know, to what extent can computational biology and systems genetics be really made open source, and do you need compute? And I think that this kind of helps answer that question as well, because in order to get this data in the first place, you need extremely expensive sequencing technologies. The kits that you use to then put into those technologies for just a single sample of sequencing are also extremely expensive. And you need a well-trained molecular biologist who knows how to operate these sequencing machines. And as a computational person, I can study the biology and ask questions while I have the data in front of me, but I couldn't tell you the first thing about how to actually go and generate this data. And so, that's, I think, a bottleneck here, because it's very hard. And I think I don't really see a clear path forward for this. But it's currently impossible to really decentralize or democratize something like molecular biology, just because of the need to actually be sitting there in a wet lab with pipettes, with the years of training behind you, with all of the expensive technology. So that's really a bottleneck in this democratization of these tools. But I think that the flip side of that is that the computational biology really can be democratized, because once you've created these data sets and once you have the sequencing technology that's out on the web, available for anybody to go and download, I then can come in with a YouTube tutorial on how to perform a genome alignment and $20 on AWS and do it myself, just as an experiment. And so I think that computational biology is really going to be one of the first steps forward in really making this a democratized platform. And that's the hope that I have for it.
So do you think that the democratized part of it's just so important, I think, for everybody? We just see the people that have the really good ideas who aren't, maybe in the system, getting them some skills and access. So that's kind of what the whole biohacker thing is all about. But do you think that, it's going back, and I'm kind of harping on the same issue, but the compute, like, is AWS, and we're not calling out the commercial cloud providers, it's amazing what's going on, but the costs get out of hand pretty quick, because sometimes you can't predict how much it's actually going to cost to run a basic experiment, because the data sets are so huge. Yeah. Like, if we truly want to get, I don't know, high school students, doing oncogenomics and trying to find cures for cancer and stuff like that, they're going to need the compute. And do you think it's like is bringing the commercial cloud providers, costs down for research purposes the way to do democratized compute, or is it just building out government systems? And I know it's kind of like boring and nerdy, but it seems to be absolutely critical. It's the fuel for discovery.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do computational biology on a desktop computer. You need something a little bit more robust. And for a lot of these analyses, especially if you're going to incorporate machine learning tools, you really need GPUs. And those get even more expensive, and so a lot of this, I think that it really is an unsolved problem right now. And, mentioning the bottleneck is not only the molecular biologists who can generate the data, but it is also making the compute available and relatively cheap, because $20 on AWS for a genome alignment, that's pushing it. It can get more expensive than that pretty quickly, like you mentioned. And so I think that what we really need is compute platforms that are dedicated to this, where, for people who don't understand this concept of a compute platform, it's quite literally you, from your own desktop computer, open up a terminal or a web page and type in a couple of fancy commands, and all of a sudden the hardware that you're connected to is located somewhere else entirely in the world, and it's a server that's set up with these massive compute clusters with extremely robust and some of the most cutting edge technology that these computers can offer. And so you can get much better performance, much more storage, much faster memory by remotely connecting to these external sources. So that's kind of the baseline for what we're talking about here. But if you can do that, wherever it is, whether it's AWS or a government compute center or a cluster that Praxis AI has set up and has allowed access to for all the biohackers within the network, whatever it looks like, that is necessary. The question just is, what form will that take as this kind of idea of a democratized research infrastructure grows?
And it's really interesting. There's a big push for broadband access for everybody, right? Around the planet too, right? There's the Starlink satellites going up, and to me, that's tremendous opportunity to connect everybody on the planet, right? It doesn't matter who they are. But that there is the compute part, like the cost of doing compute is not like buying a laptop or a smartphone and then using it.
Sure.
You're going to need more power. And so, like, I just wonder, like, I know I'm going off on a little bit of a narrow subject here, but, the road system is incredibly important for like the U.S. economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I didn't pay for the roads, myself. I had some taxes to go and do that. And so like, I guess the private sector could have built the road system, or the government could, and this is the same kind of thing like that. They have the networks, that's great, but then the compute,
Yeah.
is this a fundamental service of the government to give access? And, we could build it, people in other countries could use it, right,
Yeah.
too.
So I think it's a really important question, because it comes down to the central point of like, we can talk about this all day until we're blue in the face, but if there's no actual way to deliver this compute, you're dead in the water. I mean, there's no way to even get off the ground. And so I think that really needs to be addressed. This is one place where, to answer your question specifically about government infrastructure for these systems, I would argue certainly not. I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to move forward with this, just because for several reasons, because it's clunky. It might not have the best, it's very difficult to update. The bureaucracy, it just moves very slowly, and getting users onboarded, getting the clusters and the servers updated, maintaining the most cutting edge compute. If you have private servers like this is one thing that makes AWS so powerful, is that they are constantly updating their servers. They're constantly putting in the newest and best computers. And so I tend to be a little bit pessimistic about the ability of a centralized bureaucracy to maintain that kind of
Interesting
constant update. And this is where I actually am extremely interested in blockchain technologies and kind of building off of the cryptocurrency idea, where rather than having something like an AWS or a government center that is hosting this compute from a centralized center, what you really have, and what becomes available if you can create the blockchain technology robust enough and create the infrastructure in place, what you can have is basically, a biohacker like myself with a series of Raspberry Pis that I hook together and link up in my apartment. And if you have 10,000 biohackers around the world that have some combination, where let's say a third of them have their own form of compute, and that can be anywhere from a Raspberry Pi to an NVIDIA GPU that they have in their house. And if you have that range of biohackers that are actively contributing to the network as a part of being in the network. So part of, I'm a biohacker, I want to do this democratized compute, I want to study gene expression in cancer across various time points. I can basically have my own little computer that I connect to the network through a blockchain technology, through a blockchain hash, essentially. And then that links up with all of the other biohackers across the world. And so what you have then is basically a democratized cloud. And I think that if you can get something like that in place, you can really bring what makes cryptocurrencies so promising as a technology and make that available to independent researchers as a platform. And instead of validating transactions, validating financial currency movement across the world, what those compute clusters are doing is letting people study genetics.
Wow,
I love it.
So Discord, we do have we do have an early stage analogy for that, in the Discord, which we've started using, ourselves, which is this, cloud of servers that are free and open, but you have this this concept of membership to a server, and when you join that community, you can nitro boost, so you can use tangible real money to purchase, in effect, a cryptocurrency, a boost, which is then donated to the server to increase the capabilities of the server and therefore enhance the experience for everybody who's a member of that community. And early days, but love your vision. It's very Foundation-esque if you've ever read the Asimov novel or watched the Apple TV show. But the idea that you do have this fully democratized cloud where everybody's contributing, and I bet if you counted up the usage analytics on a typical Raspberry Pi sitting in your apartment or an NVIDIA GPU, it's probably only being used a third of the time, maybe less, but imagine if it was, if we were able to tap into that unused, time and resource.
And you think about a Raspberry Pi and you don't think about a very powerful compute, but you link up 10 Raspberry Pis together and you can do some cool things with that. And so I think that this is not unreasonable. You know, it's definitely far-fetched and it would take a lot to get to this realization, but I do think it's definitely possible. And part of the vision for this is exactly how the Cardano blockchain specifically, that one is I highlight that cryptocurrency out of the host of them for a particular reason, because the way that the blockchain for Cardano works is, rather than like Bitcoin, where you have operators who are basically mining and running very intense compute just to reveal new Bitcoin, essentially is how that works, is you run these iterative operations on the computer and eventually you strike gold and a new Bitcoin is minted. That's not how Cardano works. Cardano actually works by distributed stake pools. And so the way that that works is if I wanted to be a part of the Cardano network, could create my own stake pool. And so that could be whether it's on a Raspberry Pi in my own apartment. I could basically buy an AWS compute server and host it myself. I could do this in any of the cloud providers, or if I have my own server. So let's say I'm connected to a server that I just happen to have access to, maybe through research university is probably not the best idea because you would have some legal issues there. But however you have access to the compute, basically what I can do is spin up it's called a stake pool. And what happens is once I have that stake pool is running basically in a similar way to Bitcoin nodes work. And it's constantly validating the network. And so what it's doing is it's reading all of the transactions, like the ledger, basically across the cryptocurrency network. And as it iteratively updates, it's validating the network. And so it's basically the checks and balances to everybody else on the network. But these are running all over the place. So everybody across a whole host of operators across the world have stake pools up and running. And if I, as an independent owner of Cardano, want to then invest, I can stake my Cardano to that pool. So it's basically, it's still in my wallet, but I contribute it. It's like I tag it to a particular pool that I believe in, or I think has a good mission, because typically these pools have donations. So each one of them will have their own cause. So maybe one stake pool is donating to the Salvation Army, and I believe in that mission. So I'm going to stake my Cardano to this pool. And I believe that this democratized compute within something like a Praxis AI system could work very similarly, where if I, as a biohacker, wanted to run my own server, I could host the Raspberry Pis or the server in my own apartment. I could put them onto AWS, and then other biohackers in the network who are interested in the mission and believe in maybe what I'm researching. Maybe it's something that I can post my research thesis on the website, on the front page of the pool, and people can contribute it, almost like a buy me a coffee or a GoFundMe, where they're kind of helping to pay for the server costs. And as a result, they then have access to it. And so you can very much, you can turn this into more almost like a game and kind of play with the incentives of people want to donate to good causes. People want to be a part of cool research. And if you incentivize that well enough and work with the psychology, you can really grow a democratized platform very quickly. And I think Cardano has shown great proof of work of that, or proof of concept.
So we're off the rails here on the conversation.
Totally off the rails, but I do think that's one way it could work.
But this is really, I think this is obvious what you're saying. I've never thought about this, but like cryptocurrency mining is about generating a currency of value, something valuable, but it's an abstract value, right? It's analogous to a dollar, right? It's an extra physical currency. But if you were to take, and you have to have compute systems to be able to do that. That's what you're talking about. But if you had every other calculation, one goes towards cryptocurrency, one goes towards processing genomic data for some kid that's got cancer. Like you created a whole interlaced value structure that goes far beyond this, currency model of our species that works great. It's good, right? It abstracts things and keeps us from having to barter and allows us to go, have more people. But that's I didn't really think about the compute is being driven by this. I always think about, gaming drives computing,
right?
Drives a lot of technology, right? And then I've benefited, you've benefited, a lot of people benefited from graphics processing units, GPUs, like you mentioned. They're used just to throw, better frames per second on the screen, so you can frag people, or
Yeah.
solve a puzzle or Tetris it
Mhm.
or whatever. But
Yeah.
these are being now those have been co-opted by the research computing market, and people are making major discoveries that are very valuable for our species. But it's from gaming, which I'm not going to
Mhm.
argue gaming is bad. I'm a gamer. I like to game. But like, you can use it for two purposes, and maybe
Right.
there's a third purpose, with currency mining. And wow, the
Yeah.
future is bright.
Very much so. So that was a total tangent. We went way away
Yeah.
from chaos theory, but I do think, to your point, it's a really important question of how do you actually make this compute available? Because without it, like I said, you're dead in the water. That's kind of an a priori you need to solve.
And one of the questions I've been trying to get to for half an hour, which is, thank you guys, is actually a precursor. So I'm going to do that thing that Star Wars did, where they did the first, the middle three movies first, and then they went back to the prequels. So I'm going to go back to the prequel to that entire discussion, which is, why all of a sudden is chaos theory having a moment? It was in biology, in bioscience, it was around in the 90s, and I think systems genetics and systems biology, was a way of seeing the world back then. Fast forward, 20 years later, now suddenly it's the way, I think. I mean, you've made a really good case today, Reed, on this podcast that, if you're looking at if you're doing science right now, bioscience, in a sliver orientation, you're doing it wrong. Then is it the compute? I mean, is it the compute and the capabilities that we have now to run these gigantic exascale, data models, et cetera, in full systems that is allowing us to embrace chaos theory and systems biology, whereas maybe 20 years ago we couldn't?
I think there's definitely something to that. I don't think that it's the whole story, because even with all of the compute that we have available to us, you could take the old paradigm of reductionist biochemistry and plug it into a recursive algorithm that is just, searching for the needle in the haystack. And you have this algorithm that is just burning through compute, looking for the one master regulator that's going to lead to cancer. You could try and find a single gene that once it's turned on, you have cancer. And I would argue that's a not as fruitful of an approach, because even though you have the compute, you have the wrong hypothesis going into it, because I don't believe that's how the system is going to operate. And so I think that along with the increase in compute and the increase in computational power and just a expansion of what's possible, I think you need to couple that with the right way of thinking about the system you're trying to study. I think if you take the old paradigm and just apply it to new technologies, you're not going to get any farther. You're just going to be going in faster circles.
Is that where your yoga background comes in? I mean, you're coming at it from a holistic, perspective from the get-go.
I think that's part of it. I think that's something that definitely trained me. It was funny because I was studying yoga and learning yoga at the same time I was really being introduced to systems biology. Those two really went hand in hand for me, which is an interesting thing to reflect on, because I think I had two very impactful movements in my life where both of those things really changed the trajectory that my life was moving in, and kind of the types of questions that I was interested in. And both of those highly put a lot of emphasis on holistic thinking and thinking about the system rather than individual components. The way that I think about it, I think a very clear distillation of it is a lot of science and a lot of, the 1990s way of viewing the world was like a clock, where you have everything is deterministic, where if you know the starting state and if you know the conditions that you're working with and you know how each piece of the system works, you can deterministically predict what will happen in the future and the way the system will operate moving forward into the future. And it's very much like taking apart a clock. If you have a grandfather clock that is broken and is no longer ticking, you can take it apart piece by piece, find the tooth that is broken, repair it, put the clock back together, and sure enough, you have a functional grandfather clock. And so I think that that's the paradigm that science has adopted in most of its work up to now, chaos theory and a lot of quantum theory aside, that have been much more fringe until recently. The bulk of science has been really focused on that reductionistic problem of let's break things down to their key pieces. And if we can understand how each piece works on its own, we can then put them back together and understand the whole and how it works. But that leads to a completely deterministic world. There's no room there for chaotic outcomes or for unexpected potentials. And so I think that a better way to view the world, and the way that I've kind of come to see it both through my research with systems genetics and through just studying yoga as a philosophy, I think that the two of those kind of converge on this sense of we really need to view the universe as more like a cloud, where you can think about a cloud as a system where you can ask the question, is it going to rain in an hour? Looking at a cloud, will that cloud drop rain in an hour? And in order to understand that question, to try and answer it, you can cut the cloud in half. And you can say, okay, will this half rain, will this half? And then you can keep breaking it down. You can keep having it until you break it down to a single molecule of water. And the reductionistic paradigm would say, if I understand the behavior and the initial state of every single molecule in the cloud, then I can, with 100% confidence, deterministically predict whether or not it will rain in an hour. Better not, you could predict whether or not it will rain in 100 years, because it's that deterministic if it's truly a clockwork universe. What we're seeing, though, in biology and in physics and in meteorology and in all of these disparate fields that have begun to take an appreciation of chaos theory is that's not how the world works. Fundamentally, you cannot break it down to the key components and understand the state of the system. Really, you need to understand how each water molecule is functioning within the context of every other water molecule. So as soon as you pull one piece out of the puzzle, the whole puzzle shifts.
Yep.
It's like walking through a maze while the walls are moving around you. It's impossible to get your bearings when you begin to take pieces out of the system because it's chaotically changing immediately. And so where chaos theory comes in is really trying to understand the dynamic state of a system within the context it's operating. And I think that that's really the approach that yoga has taken to the body and to human physiology. And I think this is the approach that more and more domains of science are beginning to move into.
Fantastic.
Hey, David,
Go ahead.
I was saying I know we're going kind of longer, but I want to make sure that Reed can explain what your project is right now. This web service that you're building, and maybe if you could fit into this crazy complex stuff we're talking about.
I can definitely segue this in. So this is a huge tangent. This is a bit moving away from chaos theory, but it does relate in the way that I conceive of the human system, if you will. I'm currently working on a web application. It's a subscription-based service. I want to make it very cheap, like $5 a month, and make it highly available for everybody. But really kind of adopting this paradigm and this mentality to mental well-being and psychological health. One thing that has been proven over and over again and really has direct ties into chaos theory is that sound has an incredible impact on the human mental state, human psychology, and just human health in general. Even the physical body is extremely receptive to sound. They've done studies on musical ensembles and symphony orchestras, and they found that the brain waves of musicians that are playing in harmony with one another, playing in a band together, their brain waves actually synchronize. And so what I mean by that, and this is getting into what this website is offering, is that the way that the brain works, we think of it, and this is again tying it into the reductionistic paradigm of we think of the brain as a series of neurons that are firing and conducting information. Really, though, the way that it works is more like a network, where each of these neurons is firing, and then that leads to other networks, other neurons that are firing. And so you have these neurons that, rather than operating like deterministic switches on or off, it's more like a musical symphony, where you have harmonies and coherence, and you have discord in various parts. And so if you begin to look at the brain and the firing of the human nervous system like a musical ensemble, where there is harmony and discord, and you need to find some kind of harmonic equilibrium, well, that's what your brain waves are doing. So your brain waves are actually firing at certain frequencies. And so you can have lower frequencies in the 2 to 5 hertz range that correspond to deep sleep. But then you have higher frequencies in the 30 hertz plus range that correspond to stress and anxiety. And within there, you have intermediate ranges that correspond to intense focus. There's particular frequency bands that lead to deep, deep meditative states. There's frequency bands that lead to more creative introspection and kind of free-floating thoughts. And so you can really tune your neurology in the same way that you tune a guitar string. If you know the frequency band you're interested in entering into, you can actually tune the way that your brain is firing to actually access that frequency band. And you can do that with sound, because your brain and the way that your brain responds to audio inputs basically has a frequency following response, is what it's called, where if you play a certain frequency of music, your brain will begin to synchronize at that same frequency. And this is what leads to the musicians having synchronized brain waves when they play the same piece of music together. And so that's kind of the scientific background for what I'm trying to offer with this website, where it really is a combination of these various audio tones. And so offering within the website you can click a drop-down box and play the tone directly within your web browser. They're called binaural beats, and it plays one tone in one ear and one in the other, and your brain begins to synchronize to the delta between them. So let's say you're trying to synchronize into a 6 hertz band. Maybe you can play 40 hertz in your right ear and 46 hertz in your left ear. And this is the same mechanism that allows you to locate a sound if it's over your left shoulder. You can point to exactly where it was, even though you didn't see it or hear where the sound came from. It's because you're able to essentially triangulate where that came from. And so it's hacking into that mechanism within the brain to entrain your brain waves to this particular pattern so that you can enter into very easily these deep sleeps, these deep meditations, these intense focuses, or even like extroverted, engaged awareness on the more stressful side of the spectrum. And so that's what this is. It's called Attuning Mind. The website is Attuning Mind, ATTUNING, mind.com. It's still, in the works. It's definitely in progress, but the website is live. You can go and check it out and see the progress as it develops, for sure. But that's what this is going to be. And so I think that it definitely ties into chaos theory, because really it's getting away from the paradigm of you're stressed out. Okay, here's a drug. You can't sleep. Well, here's some melatonin. Getting away from more of this biochemical reductionism of, you have something you need to fix. Here's a single drug, a single pharmacological input that will affect it. And it's much more of a holistic approach, where really the way that we're viewing, or the way that I view the body in creating this, is as a series of oscillations. The body and the neurology is really just an electrical harmony on a massive scale. And you have an infinitude of discordant and harmonious frequencies that are playing with and against one another. And so by using sound and by using different frequencies of music to begin to bring those into a more coherent state, you can radically shift your perception. And so that's what I'm trying to offer through this website.
This is all, the mechanism of all this is happening at the molecular level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
because
you can't see that, right? You can't drill into somebody's brain when they're doing yoga and see what gene expression patterns are changing, but
yeah,
it's happening.
Exactly. And this is kind of where I view the body as more, in more and more study of this, and I think this is more directly correlated with yoga as well, which has kind of given me a chance to see the human machine and physiology a little bit differently, because I really view the body as an electrical system more so than a chemical system. And I think that perception kind of opens up a new way of seeing, because you can't think of the brain as music if you're thinking about it as a drug, as chemicals. If you think about it as a series of molecules, it's very hard to conceptualize the idea that your music could be actually, or your brain could actually be singing a harmony of tones. What we think about it as electricity, it's much easier, because all that sound is oscillating frequencies. It's oscillating waves like a pendulum. Electricity is the exact same thing. And so you have these alternating currents essentially running through your nervous system, and it runs through every single cell. So every single cell in your body is electrically active.
Yep.
not just like ionic potential active.
yeah.
So this is not just sodium potassium gates that lead to nerve impulses. This is actual conductive electricity that can be measured with a voltmeter. And that's what surrounds every single cell. And so I believe that is what this harmony of sounds is beginning to tap into, because if you stick with a given binaural beat long enough, you will begin to see, especially at more of the 6 to 8 hertz range, it's very strange because you'll actually begin to feel this. If you give this a shot and you try listening for, more than 10 minutes, if you sit with the sound for about 20 or 30 minutes, you will feel very quickly and very viscerally vibrations begin to set in your fingers and in your body. And you will actually feel this oscillatory nature of your energy. And it will very quickly change the way you think about yourself as a living system, because there's really no other way to conceptualize it. And it kind of forces you to open up your mind a little bit.
So I challenge all the biohackers out there who are listening to check out Reed's website. And what is it again?
It's attuningmind.com.
Attuningmind.com.
Yeah.
And make sure to zero in on the 8 to 6 range before the next podcast, so that you can be creatively attuned into all the wisdom you'll get on the show. So last question, we did talk about biohackers a little bit as we were going through, and you're one of the original biohackers, Reed. Thank you very much, for getting badged, for getting engaged, you've attended and participated in, our inaugural BioHackathon. You're here on the podcast. So what is a biohacker to you?
I love that y'all have termed this as a biohacker. Like, I think that word, because you come from, especially from the computational side. When I really got into the computer science, I got exposed to the word hackathon. It was like I had never heard of that before, and this idea of you can gather with a group of like-minded individuals who like solving problems and write code to try and come up with cool solutions. And the idea of a hackathon, I just got so excited about and started to do a lot more of them while I was in school. And so now to hear you guys kind of adopting this terminology of biohacker, I can't think of a term that better suits my own endeavors and my own approach to these problems. And so when I think about the word biohacker, it really combines, the idea of a hackathon in computer science with somebody who is intricately invested and deeply interested in the idea of biology and physiology. And really the key question is, you can make it as broad as you want, but really this all comes down to, how does the body work? This goes back to what I opened up the conversation with, of how does order and complexity arise out of a world that is trending towards increasing entropy and disorder and chaos? What chaos theory says is that the underlying infrastructure and the underlying foundation of our world is chaotic and probabilistic, and it makes absolutely zero sense. But then there is this complexity principle. There's this ordering principle that comes in and gives shape to it. And it almost like puts constraints around that chaos. And that is nature. Nature is what then brings the order around that chaos, and allows it to take form and become something beautiful, like a human body or like a tree or like a flower. And so that's how I see the world, and that's how I see chaos theory as it relates to the world around me. And so then to your question about what is a biohacker, I really think that a biohacker is somebody who takes it upon themselves to see the world in that light, to see the world not as a deterministic clock, but as something that can be engaged with and can be inquired about. We actually have the tools and have the ability now to ask questions about the universe that we live in and try and dive deeper into the mysteries of what makes a human body tick, because it's infinitely more complex than we think it is right now. And so I believe that a biohacker is somebody who takes it upon themselves to try and ask those questions and use the tools that are available through Praxis AI and through compute and through YouTube and through, libraries. And we have infinite resources available to us now. Any questions you want to learn about these types of fields, you can go and ask. You can ask any question and come up with an answer. The question is just how much effort you're willing to put into it and how much thought and mental capacity you really want to invest into these questions. And so the true nature of a biohacker is somebody, even if you never touch a command line, is somebody who takes it upon themselves to find the initiative to see the world in a different light and ask questions that are difficult, but might reveal really beautiful answers.
And to do it in a community. So we've got,
yeah, exactly.
hackers.bio and prxai.com. And we have a couple biohackathons coming up. So, reach out to us and sign up. It's all free. And we're trying to get people engaged in that crowdsourcing approach to bioscience research.
It's really cool.
Closing comments, Alex.
Oh, just to go off on that, a big thing that we're trying to do is remove the gap between research and education, and really trying to democratize research. And our perspective or approach is a computational approach, is a big underlying component to it all. Just because you can't process a lot of this data without that help, and you need help.
Yep.
There is nothing harder than what the kind of stuff you're talking about. But like, your ideas are fantastic, and you might not figure them out in your lifetime. But the tools are here now, so maybe we can, maybe you will, and maybe those drugs that you're taking melatonin and it's not working, but maybe understanding the pulse of how this through yoga and changing sound waves in your brain will reveal how you're supposed to administer drugs that we know have some effect, but we're just administering them wrong, right? They're not in the right sequence. And I'm going off, so I'm going to be quiet now.
No, that's wonderful. that was the vision, the statement. I
don't know what that was.
The theme.
It's highly relevant because I think that is what that sticking point and that friction that you just highlighted is really what led to I think this mission that y'all have really launched. Right. And that I have enthusiastically joined as a part of.
Thank you.
So I think that you hit the nail on the head with that as the friction point that y'all are trying to alleviate.
Find a need, fill a need, and and as we all know from physics, anytime you get friction, it creates some sort of energy, and that energy, hopefully is positive. In this case, I think yes, very positive. And Reed, we're very, very thrilled to have you on today's show. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant conversation.
This has been really fun. I've thoroughly enjoyed this and really appreciate you guys having me on. This has been cool.
Well, this will be the first of many. So who knows?
Certainly.
Where we'll go from here. But thank you so much for your time. And thank you, Alex, and everybody for listening. And until next time, cue the ending music.